Well, answer.
Isabel Saco, F. I'll take you to Latin America. The Colombian government has suspended a ceasefire with the dissident group of FARC after they killed 4 indigenous teenagers who had been forcibly recruited. And 2 months ago, another ceasefire was suspended with another armed group. And from your point of view, what is the consequence for the overall peace process in Colombia of this situation? What are the risks to come to a more violent environment? And what is the impact on the indigenous communities? Because this last story has begun there, and because they are suffering the most of this ongoing violence, because the peace agreement finally has not given all the results that we expected. Thank you.
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Yuri Aprolev for RIA Novosti. In recent days, battalions of mercenaries with a contract with the Ukrainian army have made an incursion into the Russian region of Belgorod. Dozens of civilians were injured, thousands were evacuated, infrastructure was shelling, a lot of villages haven't electricity since today, and a lot of houses were shelling too. What is the reaction of your office about this matter? Because 2 days ago, one of the representatives of the UN said they know nothing about this, and a lot of photos and videos were published after that. So what is the reaction of your office? Thank you.
Good. Yes, I will. I don't know which one.
That one? Sure.
Yeah, let's see. Look, first of all, last year we had a total budget of about 390 million. About a third comes from the regular budget of the United Nations. The rest is extra budgetary funding, meaning voluntary funding that we get from countries. It would be good to have a presence. Sometimes it can also be done through regional offices in each and every country. Of course, we are not going to have a one-size-fits-all approach. It depends on the situation. In Sudan, just to give you one example, we have a presence, we used to have a presence in 5 locations. Of course, our national staff are still there. The international staff, because of the situation, had to be evacuated. We will still have some international staff presence in Port Sudan. But given the situation, it was impossible to continue the presence of international staff at this point in time. But what we hope to achieve, and I think we've done some calculations, ideally you would want to see a doubling, which would be about 800 million per year for the organization. And let's not forget, we are the 3rd pillar of the United Nations, apart from peace and security and sustainable development. We get about slightly over 4% of the regular budgets from the UN, with a lot of requests, especially from the Council, on a wide range of issues, including, of course, to support the mechanisms of human rights, the treaty bodies, the Universal Periodic Review, the special procedure mandate holders, the whole ecosystem, but I believe also very much in presence on the ground to be precisely that bridge that I mentioned between civil society, human rights defenders, victims, and the institutions of the state, and I see great value in us being able to do that type of work. On Colombia, as you know, I was there a couple of months ago. I got a very important briefing from, again, civil society, from human rights activists, from the National Human Rights Institution, from the state. I met with President Petro and with the Vice President and with different members of the government. The Total Peace Initiative is one that we absolutely and wholeheartedly support. We knew, I think everyone who knows Colombia knows how difficult this process is. This will also, and I think including the President, that it is a rocky attempt to bring together the country and to heal the country. I'm very encouraged by the government's determination to see it through. And they are very much aware, as you know, some of the members of government are former human rights defenders that my office accompanied for years in their own struggle. They are very much aware about the plight of human rights defenders, about the plight of indigenous populations, and they will do everything in their power to address it. I think we should see these as temporary setbacks, but peace has to have a chance in Colombia for the country to be able to blossom and flourish. On your question, let me just say very clearly that, and we see the global consequences of the war of aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine. And it is in violation of the Charter, it's in violation of international law. We have made it clear to everyone that once hostilities start, civilians need to be protected, international humanitarian law and international human rights law has to be respected. We have, through our office presence in Ukraine, because we are not present in the Russian Federation, we have documented over, well, actually since 2014, ever since we were present, the violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law, and it is of utmost importance, first of all, for that war to stop immediately, and for people to be able to regain their lives in Ukraine. It's in a very much beleaguered situation where civilians suffer on a daily basis.
Thank you, High Commissioner. We'll take 3 more from the room. Jamie, Nick, and Danina.
Go first.
Oh, that's Nick.
Good morning. Xinjiang and the treatment of Uyghurs there has been pretty much eclipsed by other international emergencies in recent months. When you took office, you hailed your predecessor's report as an important document and one that you were going to engage in. Could you give us some detail of how you have engaged? And from where we sit, there's nothing to show for it. Would you say that's an accurate reflection of the situation, or is there some progress that we've missed? Thank you.
Jamie, did you want to go next? Or? Nina, please.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask you about the issue of data storage. There were human rights groups, I think yesterday, who were calling on Microsoft to put on hold plans to install a data storage center in Saudi Arabia out of fear for what that might have for implications when it comes to rights and the use of the data being stored there. Similar concerns have been raised in other places, and also in connection with the TikTok case. So maybe, could you just say something about how you view that issue? Thank you.
Hi, Commissioner. Jamie Keaton, Associated Press. There's so many subjects that you covered that it's hard to pick one to ask you a question about. That's why I'm struggling. If I could just ask, you mentioned the case of Vinicius in Spain, the soccer player. How concerned are you that the protocols that exist within FIFA and UEFA about cracking down on racism are not working enough, and what more should be done? For example, there are certain rules about suspending games after a certain number. I mean, we had a case specifically of a black person who was an effigy that was strung up in Spain months ago. These kinds of things are happening repeatedly in that country. So would you say that? And if I could just throw in response to Yuri's question, you mentioned that you don't have a presence in Russia. To be able to document and try to verify attacks against civilians in Russia, such as in Belgorod, as mentioned, would you encourage the Russian government to let you establish an office there?
Yes, so on the first question, I mean, I have been in my global update before the Human Rights Council, which I did, I can't remember exactly when, I think on the beginning of March, been very clear about the continued serious concerns that we have both when it comes to the situation in Xinjiang, but also in Tibet, as well as in Hong Kong and civic space, and I just mentioned some of the civic space issues. It is obviously for us to focus very much on how we can effect a change, and this will not happen overnight, but we are on it, and we are going to continuously work on it. As part of my functions are also, and that's my responsibility if you look at the mandate of my office, to engage in a dialogue with governments about human rights issues, and we are in the midst of that process. On data strategy and what you mentioned, you know, the biggest issue is, and we have seen a lot of progress in the European Union when it comes to the Digital Services Act and Digital Market Act, I mean, especially on right to privacy issues. That's not a universally owned achievement. So data protection and right to privacy are absolutely paramount, and that will determine the type of decisions that would be taken of where things are stored, how they are stored, in what way they are brought together. And so the call is to use human rights law, to use data protection, right to privacy, but also to see it as providing a solution to the many dilemmas that one faces in the digital area, including the type of situations that you have mentioned. And on the two questions on race, I mean, look, I feel that sports, I mean, I don't know how you call the sports organizers, FIFA, many other, I mean, it's across the board, that we need to have a hard look at human rights and sports from a wide range of perspectives. I mean, we saw what happened last year with the World Cup. We saw, so in fact, I've asked my office to prepare a policy brief on, and we will issue it and provide it in the coming weeks, because I thought it was, and we see again what happened in just recently is an example of it. I think I would like to provide a guide to those who are federations of sport, and which is so important because, of course, sport is also, I mean, it brings people together. It has a, I mean, there are so many positive things that are ingrained in sport events, but there's also, we need to deal with the shadow side as well, and that's why we want to put forward a number of clear ideas of human rights standards and sport events, and that would include, this is about participation, it's about inclusion, it's about fighting stigmatization, it's about fighting racism, LGBT, I mean, we have seen discrimination on a wide range of issues, including gender discrimination and discrimination against LGBTIQ+ people as well who participate in sports events. So we will come back to you with a very detailed guide, because we feel that there could be, that more work needs to be done by everyone on that front. No, I mean, yes, we have asked, I have asked to be able to have access in the Russian Federation. Unfortunately, until now, we haven't been able to achieve it.
All right, Bodhi had his hand up, and let's take two more from the room, and then we'll move online. So Bodhi first, please.
Next team. Question that you have mentioned the African issues. So has the OHCHR placed a significant focus in Africa in your work? And in the situations where negotiation cannot be reached with the authorities, what obstacles and challenges that OHCHR focus to promote and protect human rights in Africa? Thank you.
Thank you. Mohammed Iqbal from Turkey's Anadolu News Agency. Thank you for taking my question. German police raided two Turkish journalists' house last week and terrifying their families. Their phones, tablets, and digital items were taken while they were detained. How do you evaluate police raiding the house of journalists in a European Union member country? And from the perspective of freedom of press, do you see this as a step to intimidate journalists? Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Paula Dupré from Geneva Solutions. You spoke about your concern regarding artificial intelligence and data privacy. I'm just wondering if you can point to any positive sides of how countries may be dealing with these issues with new technologies.
So, yes, on the human rights situation in different African countries, you will have noted in my global update that I gave beginning of March, I mentioned both negative and positive trends. But I did mention a number of positive trends, especially on the African continent. And I think we also need to be aware of it. For instance, you had Zambia and Sierra Leone abolishing the death penalty. We had seen an opening up of civic space in Tanzania at the time, and a number of other countries as well. So it's important to be very clear that we shouldn't associate one continent with a human rights crisis and not look at other continents. And I, as you know, have been at pains to point out that human rights is a matter for everyone, everywhere, and that no one is perfect. And we need to be very clear about it. When it comes to the African Union, I was in Addis Ababa at the beginning of the month. I met with Chairperson Faki, the head of the African Union. We had a very good discussion about advancing the human rights agenda, and including on a strategic basis, we agreed to have regular high-level dialogues strategic dialogues on human rights, which, by the way, I also want to have with the European Union, and perhaps also with the Organization of American States, and maybe with ASEAN. I mean, we want to work very closely with regional organizations around the world. The only way to engage is to be aware about the traditions that each continent, that each country, that each culture, each religion has, and to bring this out so that we are countering what sometimes some leaders want us to believe, that these are things that come from another world. Well, they're not. They're actually, that makes us all human, and at the end of the day, it's about our rights and how we can advance them. So on the African continent, since you asked the question, yes, we have a very strong engagement, both at the regional level but also at the country level, and we need to continue it, and which is why it is so heartbreaking to see what's happening in Sudan at the moment, because I can tell you, when I speak to Sudanese, and I was there, it was my first mission, it was, I mean, I cannot even imagine what life is like in Jartum at the moment. And the solidarity has to be with the people. There's a lot of focus on the ones who waged the war, but we really have to focus on what it means in the daily lives of people when they go through this absolute horrific experience. Look, it is important, and the protection of journalists and the safety of journalists is an important aspect. I don't know the details of this particular raid, but I mean, Germany has a very robust judicial system, has a very robust system of different layers of human rights protection, so I'm confident that will make its course. So, but overall, my overarching concern around the world is the protection of journalists, including, by the way, in Turkey itself. And we need to make sure that civic space, when it comes to journalists, is always respected, and that we work on that. Look, digital, and I had a lot of discussions, both with the tech envoy, Amandip, with the tech envoy of the Secretary General, but also with Doreen Bogdan, the head of the ITU. I was even invited to an event at the ITU recently where we met with the ones who actually do standardization. This is a very technical work, as you can imagine, but sometimes in this technical work, it's exactly where the rubber hits the road when it comes to human rights. And it's clear that the world today, that the solutions to the big challenges that we face on climate change, on analysis, including for human rights purposes, we need the digital world. We need also the artificial intelligence tools. There's absolutely no doubt about it. But at the same time, and you saw, I think there were those from chat, there were those who were developing some of the chat GPT, I think, they actually came back and said themselves, we need regulation. And when that happens, you get worried because there is a bit of a sense of urgency to actually ensure that these regulations occur rather quickly. And what we have in the world today, even within countries and the bureaucracies of countries, you don't necessarily have the type of expertise that you have within companies in the private sector. So how do we match even the knowledge about some of these very complex areas, and how do we make sure that, you know, it's infused with the human rights content and the regulatory content that you need? And it goes into each and every aspect. As I said, it also goes into standardization, it goes into regulatory frameworks, and frankly, we need to all become much more conversant and literate when it comes to digital, which, of course, you know, embracing what is positive and using it for medicine, for on the climate front. I mean, there's no way that we can deal with climate change in the future if we haven't dealt with it through the digital side or through the innovation side on the technology front more generally. But we need to deal with the shadow side too.
Hi, Commissioner, we've got 5 questions online. We have time for about 3, but we'll see what we can get to. Let's start with Gabriela, then Musa, then John. Gabriela, please.
Yes, hi, Gabriela for Geneva Solutions. Commissioner, I had 3 questions. I'm going to see if there's time for all of them. You mentioned just under a dozen crises, and there's a number that you didn't mention as well: Haiti, Yemen. So there, it seems that there's a lot happening for your office, and so I wanted to go back to the question of funding. You mentioned that funding has been a perpetual issue, and we can see that as well in the number of appeals for humanitarian aid that are being sent out. So yeah, just broadly, what is your office doing to make sure that that human rights are better funded to be, and then with the number of crises at hand, do you think that it is possible for you to tackle and respond appropriately to all of them? Then my second question was about the hunger and malnutrition crisis that is currently unfolding in parts of Northern Africa. The UN is making a lot of efforts with the grain deal, but there are pockets of very concerning levels of hunger and malnutrition that this deal is not reaching. So what is being done there? And if I could also have a comment on the recent decision by the United Arab Emirates to invite Syria to the COP28. There's outstanding human rights issues with the Syrian government, and Amnesty International in particular was very critical of that invitation. So I would just like to have a comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriela. That was more than 3 questions. Maybe we'll see how much the High Commissioner can manage to respond to, because we were supposed to end actually at 10:45. If we don't get to everything, you know where to find us. Please reach out and we'll get back to you in writing, or one of our spokespeople can speak to you. Musa, please. I hope you have one question, Musa.
Merci, Rabina.
Merci.
Malheureusement, je n'ai pas pu suivre la conférence de presse dès le début. Je voulais savoir si M. Turk a évoqué certains points. Je parle de la situation dans les territoires occupés en Palestine, et aussi la montée d'islamophobie en Europe. On a tous suivi ces derniers jours l'affaire en France qui a fait couler beaucoup d'encre sur la demande du ministre de l'Intérieur de recenser les étudiants qui ont été absents pendant le Eid al-Fitr. Je voulais savoir le rôle de l'État en cette augmentation de l'islamophobie en Europe. Merci.
That was 2 questions, Musa. John Zarakostas, please, one question, I hope.
Yes, good morning, High Commissioner John, with Right for the Lancet and France 24 English channel. I'd like your views going forward in the post-public health emergency of international concern with the COVID-19. What are your concerns on the abuses that have occurred in people's right to health during this pandemic? And what is your office doing to monitor and speak out loudly where you see these abuses? And will you be speaking at the World Health Assembly currently taking place in the Palais? Many of your colleagues will be speaking.
So this was, I think, 7 questions. Look, on the first one, on the funding, and I think it was Gabriela who mentioned both humanitarian funding and human rights funding. In fact, yesterday I participated in the Interagency Standing Committee on Humanitarian Affairs, and one of the big issues, this is with the Emergency Relief Corps, chaired by the Emergency Relief Coordinator, but it has all the heads of agencies, UNHCR, UNICEF, WFP, and also the important NGO networks that are participating in it, plus IOM. I'm not going to mention all the members of the Interagency Standing Committee, but one thing that became very clear, ICRC is also participating there. So we see that there is, and unfortunately that trend has been there for quite a number of years. We have this combination of protracted conflict situations, we have the increase in new and emerging crises, and both non-international armed conflict and international armed conflict as well. Interstate conflict has become a new phenomenon. Just has to look at Europe. So the needs have exponentially increased, but there isn't the commensurate funding available on the humanitarian front. That's just the reality, and there was quite a desperate call to especially look at some of the neglected crises that don't, we have some in the headlines all the time, others are not. Haiti is a good example. You mentioned Haiti. I've been very vocal about precisely that and the terrible toll it has on the people in Haiti. It seems to be there's no sense of urgency when it comes to dealing with a situation like this. So we do need more funding. If you look, and that's what sometimes amazes me, when you look at how quickly billions can be made available when there is banking crisis and I'm sure rightly so, or including military expenditure and so forth. But when it comes to people and the plight of people, there doesn't seem to be the same. There is a lot that is happening and that's important, but we need more. And we need it not just on the humanitarian front, on the development front as well. There's a whole debate about SDG stimulus and so forth. But frankly, we also need it on the human rights front. There is actually countries, what they have, donor countries, they have a budget for peace and security, they have a budget line for development, they have a budget line for humanitarian, but they don't actually have a budget line for human rights. So I'm making the case, because of the type of things that we can prevent from occurring, because of the solutions orientation of the type of work that we are doing, that it is actually important to take human rights seriously, not just by coming to the council and having all these discussions here and working with us, but also by having and increasing the funding for the organization. I see a huge growth potential for this organization, which is in the interest and of benefit to the world. And we need to make, I think it's also on us to make this case much more compellingly. And we will work on it. So we will have a funding strategy that we are going to work on in order to increase the base for us. On malnutrition, it came up not so, you won't be surprised that it was one of the topics that we discussed among the humanitarian agencies. And in all the situations, in almost all the humanitarian emergencies, malnutrition comes up as a big topic. Because, of course, Sudan has the rainy season going to start soon, right? So if they can't plant, can you imagine what this means for the country, where you have hardly any humanitarian access that is meaningful, and if they continue fighting? So there is a real wake-up call on precisely malnutrition, and we know how terrible impact it has, especially on children in their future as well. I think it's a decision by state parties to the COP who they invite and who they don't invite. I think it is important in this process that there is also emphasis on human rights issues, on accountability issues, but also on, for instance, missing persons issues when it comes to Syria. You probably know that we have very much promoted a mechanism on missing persons in Syria. I even went to the General Assembly, and we hope that these type of issues are part and parcel of the discussions that are taking place in different fora at the moment. Bien sûr, j'ai une préoccupation énorme à l'égard de la situation en Palestine et en fait, on a vu une détérioration de la situation et il faut faire tout et on a continué à faire nos rapports et à avoir un dialogue pour qu'on puisse résoudre. C'est clair et vous avez vu probablement le discours que j'avais fait en mars à l'égard de la situation en Palestine et à la fin il faut aussi regarder toutes les recommandations que nous on a fait et essayer de les focaliser plus pour qu'on puisse avoir une action effective à la réponse. Je suis aussi, et je le dis aussi dans mon discours en mars, je suis toujours extrêmement préoccupé quand je vois toutes sortes de xénophobie, islamophobie, antisémitisme, la discrimination contre la femme, mais aussi la discrimination et les questions de haine basées sur l'orientation sexuelle et l'identité de genre. Et je pense justement qu'il faut, et comme ça je le dis dans mon statement aussi, il y a un mouvement anti-droit et il faut vraiment pousser contre ça parce que ça, à la fin, couvre tout le monde. Et si on commence à être discriminatoire envers une partie de la société, on peut s'attendre que ça va continuer avec d'autres secteurs de la société. Alors pour moi, c'est toujours, quand on voit des choses comme ça, c'est toujours une indication qu'il faut faire très attention et on doit être en alerte. Alors à cause de ça, utilisons la Déclaration universelle des droits humains cette année pour pousser contre ces tendances qui sont vraiment très dangereuses. I think on COVID, it is important to learn the lessons. And there are many lessons to be learned, both from the public health emergency side, including the human rights side. You know, very early on, we issued a human rights policy brief. It was one of the first policy briefs once once the pandemic was declared as a pandemic. I think we did it almost in April 2020, if I remember correctly. And it's good to have another look at what type of things did we see then and what has remained on the books, including some of the emergency measures. Some of them have actually not been taken away. And that has implications for human rights. At the same time, the pandemic preparedness and the ongoing discussions that you have at the World Health Assembly are extremely important as well, because we know, not least because of the world developing on the climate change and a loss of biodiversity side, we know that there will be a future pandemic and it won't happen in 100 years. It will happen earlier, and we absolutely need to be prepared for it. This is also a human rights issue for us, because there's no way that we could address it if we are not learning the lessons, and the lessons also on the international financial side. You probably saw that we haven't done well on the vaccine equity issue, on the issue of liquidity and financing for those countries, especially in the global south, that have been particularly affected. And that's a problem from a human rights equity perspective as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, High Commissioner. We've got 2 questions online and promise to get back in writing to those. Please reach out. You know where to find us. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Recording stopped.
Sie hören die Sendung Jazz Made in Switzerland. Jazz, Soul und Blues aus der Schweiz.
Vous écoutez Jazz Made in Switzerland. Jazz, Soul et Blues, Swiss Made Only.